Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guests today are John Mersheimer, who is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago, and Steve Walt, who is the Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Affairs at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School. They have just written The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. John, Steve, welcome back to the program.
It's great to be back, Harry. Nice to be here.
Help us understand the intellectual origins of this book. You're both IR specialists. The emphasis here is on domestic politics and how it influences U.S. foreign policy.
Well, basically, in the wake of 9/11, almost all scholars of international relations began to think about the Middle East and U.S. policy in the Middle East and what went wrong. And Steve and I were talking about that matter in the spring of 2002, and we pointed out to each other that there's this phenomenon called the Israel Lobby that has a significant influence on our policy that nobody talks about or writes about. And we, at that point in time, decided we would try and do something. And then through a variety of circumstances, we ended up being commissioned by the Atlantic Monthly in the fall of 2002 to write an article. And from that point forward, we began to do serious research and serious writing. And finally, in March 2006, an article came out in the London Review of Books. And that sort of exploded all across the globe and brought a great deal of notoriety to the subject and to us. And then after we wrote the article, we decided to write the book, which was then published this month here in the United States, and will be published in a number of European countries and Asian countries later in the year.
I'd just take a couple of comments. I had actually done some work on the Middle East. My dissertation, which was written here at Berkeley, looked at the Middle East in some detail. From an international relations perspective, there's a section of that book that actually deals with the domestic politics of alliances, including the domestic politics of the U.S. commitment to Israel. So I've worked on this problem a little bit in the past. John and I are both regarded as realists, as people who think that, for the most part, states calculate the national interest rather carefully, and that international politics is sort of a competitive business where if you don't calculate your interests carefully, you're going to get into a lot of trouble. And a number of people have pointed out that this book and the earlier article are somewhat contrary to the intellectual vision that we've put forward. And I think the obvious answer is this is an exception to the standard realist behavior. And our argument in the book and elsewhere is that when domestic politics intrudes too heavily into a state's calculations, into the making of foreign policy, there's some considerable danger. You'll end up doing things that are not in your national interest. And of course, one of the main themes of the book is that's what's happened with respect to U.S.-Israeli relations over time.
Is it a hard intellectual leap? I mean, I understand from what you're saying why you found it necessary to do it, but theoretically, as both of you do theory, is what is the intellectual struggle there to deal with international politics on the one hand and the complexity of domestic politics on the other?
Well, I don't think it was a struggle in the sense that it was very clear to us from the beginning that this was a case that contradicted our basic theoretical viewpoint. As Steve pointed out, there's no question that that was the case. And we never had any problems with that. We didn't try and make it fit the theory, so to speak, or anything like that. We just went where we thought the facts took us, and we told the story about how the lobby operates and how it affects American foreign policy. And I might add how it affects Israel's policy and Israel's interests as well. And our argument in the book, and we can't emphasize this enough, is that the policy is not only not good for the United States, it's not good for Israel either.
It's also worth noting that there's quite a large literature in political science on interest groups. And
okay, hi everybody. So we are now, I hope you could hear that. I didn't move the microphone to the speaker, but if in case you're interested, you can always follow John Mersheimer and Stephen Walt on their two most high profile political science, international relations and foreign policy professors in the United States. Of course, John Mersheimer, that's the man here. He is always a bit controversial, partly because most recently he has strongly criticized for years the movement of the European Union and NATO into Ukraine. He, in 2014, wrote an article that was published in maybe the most influential article for foreign policy students who study and follow foreign policy in the U.S. Foreign Policy Journal, criticizing the expansion of NATO and the European Union into Ukraine that led to Russia's intervention in 2014, 8 years ago. And he called the expansion of the European Union into NATO, into the Ukraine at that time in 2013, 2014, and the removal of the democratically elected pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, as president of Ukraine. It was basically a coup, removing the democratically elected president of Ukraine, and the European Union, for good or bad, has been seen as basically another face of NATO. And NATO means the United States, basically. So that is he's often on the news a lot in 2022 as maybe one of the most prominent and well-known criticizers of European Union and NATO policy towards Ukraine from a classical realist point of view, that Ukraine belongs to Russia's sphere of influence. It's right next door to Russia. There's a lot of people that feel strongly pro-Russian within Ukraine. How many is a big topic of outrageous anger and controversy today, obviously. He is the most prominent, maybe the most high-profile academic voice criticizing U.S., NATO, European Union policy towards Ukraine, so he's often on American news channels. I mean, again, television news is a main source of news for people who don't follow closely American debates in the journals and printed media. I just remember him when I was in graduate school over 30 years ago at the University of Pittsburgh. He was already a well-known young political scientist at the University of Chicago, and he gave a talk. He came to the University of Pittsburgh Political Science Department, where I was a graduate school at the University of Pittsburgh, and he gave a talk. And this is when the Cold War had just ended, when the communism was collapsing in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union was collapsing in 1990, 1991, and I remember when he spoke, he was a young man then still, so he still had his hair. He still had his hair, as you can see here. He still had his black hair, and he also had a black beard, right? And I don't know if he was from some city, but he spoke with a thick, it sounded like a New York accent. And I remember he was talking to the people at the University of Pittsburgh, and he said, "Do you really think that this post-Cold War era in Europe is going to be peaceful and calm? Do you recall the horrible genocidal violence that happened in the Balkans and in Ukraine during World War II? These people in Eastern Europe have not forgotten that genocidal violence that happened in World War II. So if you think that this is going to be a peaceful worldview that's going to emerge in this area after the end of communism, you're wrong." But I just remember him saying, do you really think that this is going to be? And of course, the war began in the Balkans, in the former Yugoslavia, in Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Croatia, right about that time in the early 1990s, but not yet in Ukraine. Ukraine remained relatively peaceful, at least nonviolent, and there wasn't organized violence until 2014, when Viktor Yanukovych was overthrown and the European Union moved to sign an association agreement with Ukraine. And Vladimir Putin in Moscow then encouraged the Russian separatists in the Donbass and Luhansk and Donetsk to rise up and annex Crimea, invaded and annexed Crimea pretty much non-violently at that time in 2014, added it to Russia. And then, of course, there was a low-level violence. Well, relatively speaking, there was violence going on again, before February 2022, 13,000 people had died from February 2014 until February 2022. So 13,000 people over 8 years, 1 million refugees losing their homes, moving away from their homes to get away from the fighting and the danger. Most of them going to Russia, where I think they probably had relatives and family connections. And that's before, of course, the exponential magnification of the violence in February of this year. So, all right. So, but of course, he's been controversial, and him with Stephen Walt for a while because of that, for a number of reasons, including that book, The Israel Lobby, that was published in 2007, that called out what was a public secret about the strong influence of the pro-Israel lobby in the United States that was giving Israel tremendous power capabilities so it didn't have to compromise in its objectives, like, for example, annexing basically the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and Jerusalem. Jerusalem officially, Judea and Samaria unofficially, but steadily. Hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers moving there. Hundreds of thousands have moved to that area that for them is seen as the cradle of ancient Israel, biblical Israel, right? That was occupied in 1967 during the June Six-Day War in 1967. Okay, so that is an introduction to these topics and issues that we're covering in today's class. And so let me, go back to my notes here for the foreign policy bureaucracy, and to highlight again, make sure that you can see this. So I have to stop share and then make sure that I'm opening up the right file that you can see. I've learned from using Zoom, of course, that even when Zoom says that I'm screen sharing, it might not be screen sharing. So I have to wait. I have to do it more than once to make sure that you really are able to see the screen and I'm able to see. So this is the notes that I've posted for you to look at regarding the foreign policy bureaucracy. And an important point to make, one of the important points to make is that, of course, this bureaucracy grew tremendously during the Cold War. And that Cold War lasted from, the late 1940s until 1991, 92, when the Soviet Union finally disintegrated. And over that 45 years from 1947, when the U.S. National Security Act was passed that established the U.S. National Security Council in 1947 until 1991, this vast bureaucracy emerged to carry out the policy of containment, right? Containment was a strategy the United States adopted towards the so-called perceived Russian version of Nazi Germany, that wherever the Soviet Union, in the name of communism, attempted to expand communist control, the United States must lead the world in containing and stopping and preventing the Soviet Union from expanding its influence. So containment was the name of that strategy. And that's why we're having this class right now, while you're here in Korea, I'm here in Korea, because of the Cold War and containment. The United States first fought its a direct violent war in containment in Korea beginning in 1950 because it was seen as necessary to prevent the Soviet Union from having imperial glory and success by expanding through its minion North Korea into South Korea, because it wouldn't stop if it succeeded in annexing South Korea to the communist empire. After it had already added China and Tibet, it was then going to add Korea, and it wouldn't stop there. The Soviet Union would then go on to Japan and French Indochina, as it was called, the French Indochina, which is today Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and all of Southeast Asia, and then all of Asia, and then eventually Europe and the world. And so this bureaucracy emerged to carry out containment. This bureaucracy was the instruments the United States government created to institute the strategy of containment all around the world, including, of course, the U.S. military, the Defense Department, and also the non-military security organizations like the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, the 17 different intelligence agencies that the United States has in total, including, in each armed forces, Navy, Army, they all have their intelligence components. So, and the other policies that were adopted as well, for example, the National Space and Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, that oversaw the U.S. effort to go to the moon, was created during the Cold War, and as part of this competition, indirect competition, the nuclear era and the nuclear setting, with nuclear weapons being available, to try to compete for world influence by appealing to people's brains and hearts, by showing you and the whole world that the American system is the better system because we got to the moon first before the Soviet Union. All of these organizations, these foreign policy bureaucracies, were created, some earlier. Of course, the U.S. State Department has been around since the founding of the United States at the end of the 18th century. But the U.S. National Security Establishment, as it's called, all of these foreign policy organizations expanded tremendously during the Cold War. The State Department might be the oldest, but by far bigger is the Defense Department. The Defense Department is much, much bigger, magnitudes larger in terms of resources and controls, in terms of money it receives from the U.S. government than the U.S. State Department, because of the military components of containment, and it continued 30 years after the Soviet Union disintegrated because of the American belief that, it proved that America's hegemony is benign hegemony. Keep in mind, I looked at your midterm drafts, right? And one of you kept referencing benign hegemony. I'm not saying that the U.S. hegemony is benign, but that's the portrayal that often you find coming out of Washington, including by political scientists who are sympathetic to that viewpoint, that American hegemony is different from Nazi German hegemony or Japanese imperial hegemony or Soviet Russian communist hegemony. American hegemony is benign, is a good thing, because it saved the world from the Russian version, supposedly saved the world from the Russian version of Nazi Germany by successfully containing it in Korea, not so successful in Vietnam, but successful enough so that eventually the Soviet Union was not able to compete under the strain of the rejuvenated containment strategy under Ronald Reagan, when he was elected president in 1980. And that was the coup de grace that led to this, supposedly in this worldview, which is the dominant view in Washington to this day, that the United States was responsible, played a critical role in Gorbachev coming to power, Mikhail Gorbachev coming to power in the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union realized collectively it could not win the Cold War. And so it had to make peace. And Gorbachev emerged because of the Soviet view that they had to make peace with the United States because they could not compete against the United States. And that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, of course, with this vast foreign policy bureaucracy that emerged, employing hundreds of thousands, even millions of people, if you include the soldiers that were in the U.S. Defense Department, who were in the Army and the Navy and the Air Force, the millions of people that worked in the bureaucracies and in the companies and corporations that supplied the U.S. Defense Department, that supplied the agencies for aid and development around the world. Because, for example, I was told you I was at the American University in Bulgaria from 1994 until 2009. And one of the biggest funders of supply of money for the American University in Bulgaria was the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. And the United States Agency for International Development was created under the John F. Kennedy administration, again, to compete for influence around the world with the Soviet Union, emphasizing producing what we call soft power today, that America is helping the poor and underdeveloped parts of the world develop through economic and educational and health policies as part of the United States Agency for International Development. So that organization is only from the early 1960s, was created under the Kennedy administration, but that was all, again, part of containment, right? And those organizations, so those organizations include not only the bureaucracies in the government, but also the companies that supply those bureaucracies, that supply the tanks, the guns, the ships, the missiles, the submarines, the planes. the contractors that support USAID by going and doing development projects in Africa and in the Caribbean and Latin America. Those companies that provide $500 billion a year in goods and services to the U.S. government. $500 billion a year was what I read a couple of years ago. Over $500 billion. Those companies also are all part of this emerging vested interests in the official and private sector that believe they won the Cold War, that believe American influence and hegemony around the world is benign, and that lobby and pressure and vote in American elections and support American political figures that are committed to America continuing to play this critical role around the world today in 2022, 30 years after the Cold War ended. Right? And they have their arguments as to why they are important, right? They point to, as we described earlier, how the United States withdrew from the world after World War I, and that didn't do good for Europe, even though the United States was so powerful. Woodrow Wilson, according to Hans Morgenthau disliked Woodrow Wilson. Hans Morgenthau thought President Woodrow Wilson was a fool. Woodrow Wilson, by the way, was a political scientist at Princeton University before he became a politician. Woodrow Wilson was like the third president of the American Political Science Association while he was a college professor at Princeton University before he became governor of New Jersey, and then I think became president of the United States. Hans Morgenthau, the realist scholar that we highlighted in that video clip that I showed you in class earlier, he mocked Woodrow Wilson because he believed Woodrow Wilson actually believed his own propaganda as to why the United States was involved in World War I, that the United States was fighting World War I, entering World War I in order to make the world safe for democracy, according to Woodrow Wilson. The United States is entering World War I as World War I will be the war to end all wars. And that the United States needs to just institute democratic political systems in Eastern Europe and new countries of Eastern Europe. And that's why the United States is entering World War I. And that's not the real reason, according to Hans Morgenthau, the United States entered World War I. The United States had to enter World War I because it was the biggest power in the world already by that point, economically at least. It should have stayed in Europe because Europe belonged to its sphere of influence because it was so powerful. It should have stayed there. According to Hans Morgenthau's theory of realism. But Woodrow Wilson, because he was committed to these ideological notions of human rights and democracy, and he couldn't get the U.S. Senate to approve the Treaty of Versailles establishing the League of Nations because the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Congress didn't want to fight wars to keep Polish people free or keep Bulgarians free. For democracy. He should have used different rhetoric, different language to persuade the U.S. Political system collectively to stay involved in Europe after World War I, and maybe the United States could have helped prevent the intense conflict and competition among European powers that made their economic problems worse, contributed to the Great Depression, and then saw the rise of fascism and Nazism in Italy and Germany. So, Woodrow Wilson was this target of mockery by people like Hans Morgenthau. But of course, the claim is the United States learned its lesson and has remained in Europe, in the world, 30 years after the Cold War ended. The war that was cold because of nuclear weapons, because the Soviet Union could not fight directly the United States, and the United States could not fight directly the Soviet Union because World War III will be a nuclear war, so they fought indirectly, and the Americans won. And they won, and they should continue to provide their benign hegemony, not just in Europe, but also into the Middle East and elsewhere, and do in the Middle East what the Americans supposedly did in Europe and East Asia. Provide benign hegemony that overcomes the security dilemma by providing hegemonic structures so that even though French and Germans might not like each other, they can cooperate because they know the benign hegemon, the Leviathan, according to Thomas Hobbes, the American Leviathan is there. And, South Koreans and Japanese have their problems, but they cooperate. Why? Because there's 30,000 soldiers in South Korea and 50,000 American soldiers in Japan. That's why. And so the Americans should do the same in the Middle East, and they will under Donald Rumsfeld and George W. Bush intervene in the Middle East, in Afghanistan and Iraq, and bring peace to the Middle East the way they have brought peace to Europe and more or less peace to East Asia. So, I laugh, of course, because I'm from a realist point of view. Hans Morgenthau, he would point out, all aspiring hegemons always claim that they're trying to do what for their expansion of their influence is to make the entire world a better place, according to their nationalistic universalism. It's not just for the glory and power of France, or the glory and power of Russia, or the glory and power of Japan. It's to liberate everybody everywhere. So, so again, just to show you these complexities, I'm presenting with you my viewpoints in these topics, but back in at the end of March, I went to a conference at the International Studies Association. Is one of these professional academic organizations that professors go to talk about these topics, right? So the International Studies Association, mostly political science people go to it. I already mentioned the American Political Science Association. So all of these places, by the way, they have annual conventions. So let me show you. I mean, I belong to the ISA, so I will probably go to the ISA convention in next year, next spring. So let me share the screen. So here you see the International Studies Association website. That there's a regional conference coming up on Zoom that I will attend on November 1, in a couple weeks' time, the Northeast Association. So I went to this national meeting. What was it? It was in 2022 in Nashville, Tennessee, and I don't see it here. Where is it? What was in Nashville, Tennessee? The conference there, and this one of the people that I saw speak there was this woman named Kori Schake. And so Kori Schake, I mentioned that Kori Schake is let me see if I can find it here. Is this it? Yes. She works at the American Enterprise Institute. So I highlighted how the Hoover Institution is an old, right-wing, prestigious think tank. A Policy Analysis Institute, a think tank, I think was covered in one of your chapters. But the people that support the more assertive and American foreign policy come out of other think tanks. One is the American Enterprise Institute. And this woman, Kori Schake, she was at one of these conference panels that I attended at the International Studies Association conference at the end of March this year. And she's younger than me, much younger than me, and she sat at the conference table, while there's about 50, 60, 100 people in the audience. And she didn't say much. She just sort of sat there, looking like this. And then I saw a couple weeks ago, she has an article here in the New York Times calling upon the Biden administration to be more assertive that the U.S. government budget, Defense Department budget, is still not big enough. It says here Kori Schake directs foreign and defense policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. This is where Trump and others, the Republican Party, get their people that work in the administration when they win the presidency in elections in the United States. The people, this American Enterprise Institute, they provide a disproportionate number of people that become political appointees, the Secretary of Defense, and they're really right wing. And she directs the Foreign and Defense Policy Studies Institute section at that American Enterprise Institute. And she says that the U.S. Defense Department budget under Joe Biden is not big enough. Remember, we talked about how it's now up to $880 billion. She mentions here the Biden administration is bungling its messages bad enough. In other words, he's claiming the Biden administration is not providing enough assertive American leadership against Russia and China. that it's appearing to, be too cautious in opposing Russian aggression in Ukraine and Chinese threats to Taiwan. The Biden administration bungling its messaging is bad enough, but worse are the real gaps in capability that call into question whether the United States could indeed defend Taiwan. The ships, troop numbers, planes, missile defenses in the Pacific are a poor match for China's capability. The Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, has assessed that the threat to Taiwan between now and 2030 is acute, yet the defense budget is not geared to providing improved capabilities into the mid-2030s, another 12 years from now. More broadly, the Biden administration isn't funding an American military that can adequately carry out our defense commitments, a dangerous posture for a great power. You know from your reading, U.S. itself budget spent is 40% of the total world expenditures on defense is just the United States. The Democratic-led Congress added $29 billion last year and $45 billion this year to the Department of Defense budget request, a measure of just how inadequate the Biden budget is. It's still not big enough, according to her. So here, this is somebody that clearly believes in American benign hegemony, that America must provide global leadership, that America must do these things, America must be committed, America must be everywhere, America must be active in Taiwan and in Korea, in Ukraine. She's all into this. And, and this is maybe the most prestigious, not prestigious, but the most influential policy analysis institute, the slang term is think tank, in the United States today, because it's not the only one, but is one of the main policy analysis institutes that when the Republicans come into office, when they win the presidency in elections in the United States, a disproportionate number of the experts they bring in to become the political appointees at the top of the political system to head the bureaucracy come from the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, and from other institutes as well. But this is the most high profile one, along with the Heritage Institute. And so I didn't know she was the director. I mean, she's young, at least 20 years younger than me. And she's the fact that she's female, obviously shows that they claim that they're not old-fashioned conservative traditionalists, that they favor gender equality and so on. So. And that's one of the things the Americans do. They promote their values, including liberal democracy and human rights. So she wants more money spent on the U.S. defense budget beyond the $880 billion already being spent. So let's do something here. I mean, because I want you to be excited about these topics because, well, we're at a dangerous time in this world with the crisis in Ukraine, and so I highlighted how Dr. Shockey is in conflict with Dr. Mersheimer. They're both political scientists, so political scientists are as divided as the American political elites regarding what is the proper role of the United States in the world today. And, and of course, he's obviously has a different perspective than Dr. Shockey, Corey Shockey, the American Enterprise Institute has. So let me see here in terms of highlighting some of these topics. Let me go back to the notes here. So we go back to screen share and go to the notes. And I think these are the notes. So I think I just closed this file because it's just too many files that are open and confusing me in terms of finding things. So you can see here, you highlighted some of you in your midterms. Of course, your midterm drafts were submitted before we started covering this chapter. So, but that from some of the earlier chapters that, the Congress tends to defer or let the U.S. president play the leading role in making U.S. foreign policy. that bureaucracies have a significant degree of individual autonomy. In some of my comments on your midterms, I highlighted how some people claim that this bureaucracy, the so-called what Trump called the deep state. Donald Trump claims that he was opposed by this bureaucracy in his domestic and foreign policy initiatives. That this vast bureaucracy that emerged during the Cold War is committed to getting more and more money from the US government for the funding these organizations and the jobs that these hundreds of thousands, even millions of people have. And so they see the world in a way which justifies themselves, and they paint a picture of the world, and they also, through their behavior and their lobbying, they manufacture or worsen America's threats and dangers, because by having a more dangerous Russia or a more actively aggressive China, that again reinforces the need for these big bureaucracies in the United States and the money that they receive from the US government, because we got this big problem now with Russia and China and North Korea, and that they help make the problems that they claim exist, because by doing that, they justify themselves collectively and the money they receive from the US government collectively. But the beginning of this creation of this modern bureaucracy began with the 1947 National Security Act, and it created the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, and the CIA. And this might be one of the bureaucratic initiatives that the rest of the world has adopted, this National Security Council format, right? So for example, if you go to Wikipedia and you go to, let me see, open up a Wikipedia page here, just to show you what I'm referring to. If you put in National Security Council, you get something like this. So make sure that I can, I'm sharing the screen again. So you can see here's the National Security Council. It's a National Security Council is usually an executive branch government body responsible for coordinating policy on national security issues and advising chief executives on matters related to national security. And so you can see all the countries that have adopted this National Security Council model. The United States, of course, is here, but look at all these other countries that have adopted this National Security Council model after the United States did. I mean, these are all since World War II. Some of these are more recent, like for example, China's national, well, let's look at Japan for, okay, well, let's see, we'll click here. Yeah, the Central National Security Commission was established in 2013, 9 years ago in China. I still think you can see this. Let's go to Japan. I mean, this has all happened since I've been in Korea. I've been following this. So I know, I think Japan did. Yeah, Japan was formed in 2013, 9 years ago. What about South Korea? I think there is, I have to find South National Security Council. Of course, here you can see South Korea's National Security Council. It's been formed since 1963, which is not surprising considering it's such a close ally of the United States. So this has been some initiative. What about the Russian Federation, Security Council of the Russian Federation? I think this was adopted 1992. Right after the Soviet Union collapsed, right? So this seems to be a model that has been adopted around the world, which, you know, what about France? Since we have some French students here. Oh, I don't see, nobody's entered it for France. Well, interesting. So, so this National Security Council is seen as something necessary in the world after World War II with nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, given the interdependence of countries, not just military security interdependence, right? That, you know, if we fight World War III, we all die. So that's pretty interdependent, right? But also economic interdependence, that there needs to be more centralized control over a country's foreign international behavior in the form of its bureaucracies and its different bureaucracies, that needs to be more coordination and central control over that by the executive branch. So this is a tendency you see throughout the world, not just the United States. So and so the United States Security Council, we click here, and there you see was established again in 1947. Again, when the Cold War is intensifying, right? The belief that, I mean, keep in mind, the United States was able to fight the Second World War without a National Security Council. And there were problems. There were perceived problems with how the United States fought that war, like the Pacific War in World War II. The U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy didn't coordinate very well at all in their military strategies against Japan during World War II, and that was an issue, right? So, but of course, also by 1947, the Soviet Union, the United States their relationship is becoming more and more conflictual. There's a civil war in Greece that the Americans are blaming Stalin for instigating, trying to encourage supposedly the Greek Communist Party to seize power, which was not correct, but the Americans believe that Stalin somehow was behind the Greek Civil War. So I think, that's not discussed enough anywhere, but you can see here, I think you can see this, right? The Greek Civil War took place between 1943 and 1949, even before the World War II was over. And this was something which Tito in Yugoslavia, the communist ruler in Yugoslavia, carried out, that he instigated this. He supported, this wasn't Stalin. But I was taught 40 years ago, when I was an undergraduate, your age, that no, this was part of Stalin's global effort to expand communism in the wake of the destruction and turmoil after World War II. That Stalin and the Soviet Union were trying to do what Hitler and Germany tried to do after World War II, that they're trying to do what Germany tried to do. And so this is from 1943 to 49. The Tehran crisis, another one was I don't know, I'm not going to really find it here, but the United States believed that Iran, that Stalin was putting pressure on Iran, Turkey, and that was when the U.S. government announced the Truman Doctrine, that the Truman Doctrine was the commitment of the United States to provide aid and assistance to any country which was under pressure. It was announced to Congress by U.S. President Harry S. Truman on March 12, 1947. Right, the same year that the U.S. National Security Act was adopted to create the U.S. National Security Council, right? It was basically aimed to contain communist uprisings in Greece and Turkey and elsewhere. So this belief that the U.S. president is dealing with this diabolical enemy, the Soviet Union, and Stalin doesn't need to deal with all of the complexities of policy making that exist in a democracy United States, like the United States, right? Stalin doesn't need to deal with a Congress and doesn't need to get congressional votes and doesn't have to deal with elections and newspapers and television and freedom of speech. No, the Soviet Union is a monolithic entity instigating worldwide efforts to spread communism in order to spread de facto Russian imperialism, and in the name of communism. And the U.S. administration needed to have the centralized control to act wherever was necessary to act, wherever this communist worldwide expansive effort attempted to expand, to see wherever there was weakest resistance, whether it be in Korea or in Greece or elsewhere. And so the U.S. president needed to have the control and the authority to do what needs to be done against this Russian version of Nazi Germany, and instituting worldwide communist expansion efforts and conspiracies. So, as I mentioned in some of my comments on your midterms, right? The United States Truman administration sent American troops to fight in Korea without asking the U.S. Congress for approval, like they did, a few years earlier during the Second World War, when the United States declared war on Bulgaria and Romania during World War II. Truman, several years later, in 1950, just sent the soldiers from Japan to go into Korea and fight in Korea, and didn't ask the U.S. Congress for approval first. Later, the U.S. Congress would come around and provide de facto approval, not through declaring war on North Korea, but by passing resolutions that basically were considered to be the equivalent of formal declarations of war. Use of authorization, use of military force authorizations. And that's what the U.S. Congress has done during the Cold War and after, not formally declared war. But the belief is he had to have this authority to do that because the communists are dangerously cunning and organized and subversive. So back to the how this applies to today. Again, here we are in 2022. The prevailing view in the United States is that the United States won the Cold War. That the United States saved the world from the Russian version of Nazi Germany. And so now this vast national security establishment has continued to exist and perhaps self-servingly continues to expand and of course has its supporters like Dr. Corey Shockey at the American Enterprise Institute, and many others in the United States. And so let's do an exercise because I've done a lot of talking, and let me open up. Go back to the notes here to the notes for the chapter, and so they mentioned here, this National Security Act created the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, and it also created the Central Intelligence Agency. And the CIA, this is all created before the Soviet Union demonstrated it had nuclear weapons. But just 2 years later, in 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb to show the world it has nuclear weapons. So this provided added incentive for the United States to engage in containment through a global effort that was more indirect. You couldn't fight a war directly with the Soviet Union because it will be the end of the world because of nuclear weapons. So that meant the Central Intelligence Agency in the United States and the KGB, the Soviet CIA, and every other organization together in the KGB, the Komitet Государственной Безопасности, the KGB, they ended up fighting their global competition for influence everywhere, indirectly in all of the countries of the world, in France, in Italy, in Belgium, in Korea, of course, in Vietnam, in Africa, all the countries of Africa, all the countries of South America. The CIA and the KGB engaged in competitive political interference in the internal politics of those countries as direct conflict was displaced to avoid escalation in military conflict between two nuclear powers. And so we talked briefly about that, how the CIA intervened in Iran in 1953 and in Guatemala in 1954 and Cuba in 1960. But that happened. Those kinds of interventions to varying degrees of intensity happened pretty much everywhere by both the KGB and the CIA competing with each other as, well, my view is that the KGB, the Soviet Union, was trying to contain the United States. The United States was trying to contain the Soviet Union. The prevailing view in the Soviet Union was that the United States was an aggressive imperialist power. So they're both trying to contain each other in this nuclear environment. And so Professor Hook, the author of your textbook, goes on to describe how these foreign policy bureaucracy demonstrates path dependency. That is, the pattern in which past decisions create vested interests and views that push future choices in particular directions. So that's a nice, calm way of saying that the national security establishment that was begun in the late 1940s has created vast organizations involving hundreds of thousands, even millions of people whose jobs and careers and identities depend upon these organizations that tend to see the world in a self-serving way. So of course, if I'm part of that vast national security establishment, maybe I'll be unusual, but most people who serve that national security establishment believe that it's necessary and good for the world. And they will see the world in a way that accords with that self-serving belief. And they will emphasize, for example, the importance of the Defense Department. The Defense Department is much bigger than the State Department. So that's a point Hook makes in the chapter, right? That the United States has a predisposition or predilection to rely more on the US military and Defense Department in terms of dealing with foreign policy challenges, just because the US Defense Department is so big and has so many resources established all over the planet, in all hundreds of military bases everywhere around the world. So of course the US government is going to rely heavily on the US Defense Department to deal with challenges like Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Because you use the tools you have, and these are the tools that we created and founded during the Cold War and have expanded tremendously to the present. So that's a nice way of saying that, this path dependency view. So, for example, the fact that the Defense Department is so vast in comparison to the State Department is an indicator that foreign policymakers are likely to make foreign policy decisions that emphasize military rather than diplomatic solutions. So, and so in Washington, advocates for promotion of global environmental protection are likely to face more political difficulties because there is not a large federal agency responsible for the global environment, right? So, like, let's just get this done because I keep putting it off on the cyber campus. Let's say you think human beings colonizing space is really necessary and important. How are you going to do that? Well, one way that you might want to do that is by encouraging the United States national security establishment to expand America's national security policies and infrastructure out into space. Because, you know, you want to organize a society to do these things, you have to use the tools that are already created to do that. Like I said, the United States went to the moon over 50 years ago, not just because they wanted to go to the moon because it's a good idea. It went to the moon because it was competing with the Soviet Union as part of containment, indirectly to convince you and me that the American system is better. And the United States spent hundreds of billions of dollars to go to the moon. Now, of course, there were lots of economic and technological benefits from that, right? I mean, you know, that's the argument often made for the US space program, that it's not just great to go to the moon and send vehicles and exploration satellites to Jupiter. It also develops the US economy, right? That so many new technologies were developed as part of the space program that helped make the United States dominant, influential through its superior technology. Like, you know, the claim is made that the semiconductor was developed for the space program that became the foundation for the digital age. You know, and lots of other technologies were developed as part of the space race to get to the moon before the Soviet Union. And the claim, you know, so that there's lots of technological, economic benefits that come from these kinds of programs. But you see, the Americans have a problem with this because the Americans, as we talk about in the American history class, they have a political culture that is more suspicious about the role of the government in the economy. They're more suspicious as a culture regarding the role of political intervention in the economy by the government in the form of the state authorities than, say, in France or Korea, or Europe and Asia in general. Europeans and Asians, they don't resist or think or are not suspicious about the role of the government in playing a leading role in trying to develop the country. The Americans, because of their unique history, they have more of a cultural, ideological American creed hostility or suspicion of government involvement in the economy, except in national security and fighting war. So the United States is hostile overall to this notion of an industrial policy. Like industrial policy is mocked, particularly by Republican figures. So you don't call it industrial policy in the United States. The government should not be picking winners and losers, they say, in American political discourse. The US government should not be picking companies and technologies to promote, because the government probably is going to be ineffective and incompetent, and it's not as effective as the market in doing it autonomously. But if you promote these policies as necessary to develop the military capabilities to defeat the Soviet Union, or maybe to compete with China today in 2022, the People's Republic of China under the totalitarian dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party, then Americans start to listen. If you say, we need to go back to the moon because China is going to go to the moon. Oh my God, China's going to the moon. The People's Republic of China under the Communist Party is going to go to the moon. Well, now we better reinstitute our space program. And so you can have an industrial policy, but you can't call it an industrial policy. So, the claim is made, for example, the internet. I'm teaching you over Zoom, over the internet. That was developed part of the Defense Department, the US Defense Department, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. So if we're going to go and begin to build the infrastructure for colonizing space, you might want to applaud this effort to move this vast national security establishment in the United States to focusing more on outer space and space as part of American national security strategy, because there's a tremendous amount of resources there and political support. Once you build a US Space Force, you create path dependency, that you're going to create a body of people and organizations that are going to be committed to that. They're going to lobby and pressure the US government and the elected political officials to continue to support those policies and create a commitment to having permanent human American habitation in, let's say, a moon base. We already got, the space, the International Space Station, to creating a permanent base on the moon. But you got to convince people that this is a good idea, and so you're going to have to convince people, and somehow this is beneficial in many ways, including competing now with China, because Russia's economy is so weak compared to the rest of the world. And so you could make the argument that if you think it's really important for human beings to move out into space, that somehow it needs to be part of the US national security establishment, because that's the only way you can mobilize the necessary resources to do these things. Then, of course, now we do have civilian space contractors like Elon Musk's SpaceX and Jeff Bezos' Blue Horizon. But those independent private companies are using the infrastructure that was originally created back in the 1960s during the US government's commitment to getting to the moon first before the Soviet Union, as announced by John F. Kennedy when he came into office. So SpaceX and Blue Horizon and Virgin Galactic, all of these private space companies, they're still using the infrastructure that was created by the US national security establishment during and after the Cold War. And when people look to, for example, the history of colonization, right? Yeah, sure, it was the British government and the Spanish government and the Portuguese government that first made exploration into the New World. But then, of course, to make that sustainable, you had to get private investment. You had to get people committed to their own career and economic benefits to make those colonies in North and South America and elsewhere profitable. sustainable. So you could say that Donald Trump might get credit for creating the U.S. Space Force. I should say, however, you know, when you look at the history, for example, of Nazi Germany, the Nazis in Germany, they were fascinated with technology too. I mean, they thought high tech was it. That was going to be the justification, one of the justifications for Nazi rule in Germany, that they were modernizing Germany. They were putting Germany on the cutting edge of technology with you know, back then in the 1930s, what was the newest technologies in transportation. The first diesel trains were developed by the Germans, you know, diesel fueled trains, the Hindenburg dirigible Zeppelins that blew up in, you know, New Jersey was supposed to be a new technology. I mean, there was also, so there were fascist tendencies in Donald Trump's administration and authoritarian populist tendencies in the United States government, which bring that to mind, right? That, you know, that just, again, as a comparison. So let's go to this new announcement after Donald Trump left office, of course, that the U.S. Space Force has been created, and to the point that it now even has its official march as the newest fifth branch of the U.S. military. Of course, originally, you know, the U.S. Constitution only makes reference to the Army and the Navy, and then the Air Force emerged during World War II as part of the Army. And then after, well, I think it's with the National Security Act in 1947, the Air Force was separated from the Army and became the third branch of government. The Marines have always been part of the Navy as Navy-based infantry. And that was recognized as a separate branch, although it's still part of the Navy. The Marines are considered a separate branch of the military. So they're representing the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the U.S. top military command, the Marine General, along with the Air Force. And now that Donald Trump has created the fifth branch of the U.S. military, the U.S. Space Force within the U.S. Air Force, like how the Marines are in the U.S. Navy. And they have a new Space Force song and a march, the way the Army and the Navy and the Marines have a march. So they have a new U.S. Space Force march song, Semper Supra. Of course, American Marines have their slogan, Semper Fi, which means always true, always honorable. Semper Supra means always above, right? So if we go to the cyber campus and we go to material, I think I have that somewhere. Oh, sorry, I got to go back. I have to sign back in, log in. And we go to American foreign policy and make sure that you can see this. So let me share screen again. And here we go here. And then we go to material. And yeah, so note that that isn't got Chinese subtitles. And again, in terms of this path dependency, Joe Biden campaigned against Donald Trump and defeated him. But Joe Biden has not canceled the Space Force as Donald Trump's initiative. This began under Donald Trump. And Joe Biden has not canceled it. And it has also continued to develop. And so my question to you is, do you think the Space Force is cool? And so just to go through that. So I think some of you have already voted. So if you haven't voted, I think pretty much everybody did vote. So some of you are neutral. It's anonymous, right? So I don't know who you are. So you can change your vote if you want to. I guess, since you have until 12 o'clock. But so I guess since it's anonymous, I don't know who voted, so we won't be marking the participation credit on that. But I guess that's the importance. If you're going to think about building strategies for governments, you've got to use the tools that you have, and the tools are the bureaucracies. And the bureaucracies contain not only capabilities internationally, but they also contain, for good or bad, political capabilities and forces and weight domestically. And so that's the point made in terms of into the Hook textbook, that you can say global climate change, that's a challenge that's threatening human civilization. Oh my God. But in terms of moving the US government to move in that direction to address that, you have a serious problem in terms of redirecting funds from the US government, because you have a vast national security establishment that these organizations don't want their budgets cut. They're going to resist having their budgets reduced to give more money to the US Environmental Protection Agency to deal with the global climate catastrophe that's looming over human race, because they don't, it's just organizational tendencies to do that. Ideally, if you try to work with those bureaucracies, so for example, there has been efforts to try to convince Americans that global climate change is a national security threat to the United States, that the Defense Department should be concerned about this. The vast, large US Defense Department should be concerned with climate change because it threatens America's national security. How? Because it destabilizes friendly regimes in Africa and South America because of the economic catastrophes that drought and floods generate. That China is competing to offer development aid to these countries that are poor and now face the terrible challenges of trying to develop amidst global climate change. And so we have to compete with China to offer an alternative model to appeal to African countries and Asian countries and countries in Latin America as they're not only trying to develop themselves out of poverty, but now we're trying to do that along with trying to deal with the costs of global climate change. We have to do this to compete with China. That's the kind of rhetoric that you're seeing now coming out of Washington, right? And from a strategic point of view, it's necessary to do that because you have to get political support from the vested interest that already exists in Washington or anywhere, in Paris, in Moscow, Beijing, and Seoul. So, all right, so let's go on here. And of course, that's the argument made for developing the Space Force, that China has made a commitment to get to the moon. China's ruled by a communist party. We have no choice, but we must go to the moon, and we must go to Mars, and we must get to Mars first. Just to show you and be there first that the American system is the best system. So again, I'm an old man. I remember, the US space program, watching it on television when I was a child. I remember the moon landings. I remember the last Apollo 17 launched to the moon 50 years ago this month or last month. I mean, I remember all that. It just amazed me as a child. And but again, I mean, it happened because of the Cold War. And so, and the fact that the Americans are nationalistic as a nation state means they're vulnerable to those kinds of projects and plans, like the Germans, like the Russians, like the Chinese, as nation states. They're more vulnerable to trying to strive and to project tremendous influence, even overestimating the relative power capabilities. And the Americans do that, and the Germans, of course, did that, and the Russians may have done it in Ukraine, evidently as well. And maybe China will do it regarding Taiwan, because they're intensely nationalistic as well. But as a polity, as a political system. So, so on that note, here's an exercise. So let's role play. Let's role play for a bit, okay? So let me open up the notes here, the lesson plan. I think this is the lesson plan for today. And okay, so This is Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. This is what Woodrow Wilson said, why America's entering World War I, to make the world safe for democracy, to promote capitalism and democracy and so on. So of course, Hans Morgenthau mocked Woodrow Wilson because Woodrow Wilson is guilty of believing his own propaganda. And he was supposed to understand that you use those words and those symbols to mobilize your people and to appeal to Frenchmen and German, appeal to the rest of the world to support the United States. But you have to be cynical and cold and rational as a senior political figure, understanding that you're really doing this because states must advance to their borders of their spheres of influence. Because if you don't do it, it will cause more problems in the world, more instability and more hardship and violence and miscommunication and unnecessary war. So again, I just wanted to highlight that. And so, but then go back to the note. So here's the U.S. National Security Council list of components from the Wikipedia site, and you can see here that I've assigned you briefly to these different positions. So the President of the United States is Young, make sure you can see this, is Young Chi. Here it is. The President of the United States is Yang Chi-yun. The Vice President is Decroix Blandine Marie Anne. The Secretary of State for the United States is Gerard Lucille Marie. The Secretary of Defense is Jolan Milo Samuel Elliott. The Secretary of Energy on the U.S. National Security Council is Vladimir Kowalski. The Secretary of the Treasury, these are all, energy, treasury, not directly focused on military and defense, but clearly understood to be part of national security strategy making for the United States. So the Secretary of the Treasury is Remy Tamine. The Attorney General in charge of the justice system and protecting American civil rights and doing what is necessary to protect the United States from foreign spies, because the Federal Bureau of Investigation belongs to the Justice Department under the Attorney General of the United States. The Attorney General is the top official of the U.S. Justice Department. It oversees the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which is responsible for counterintelligence and stopping Russian, Soviet, Chinese, Korean, French spies in the United States. And then the Secretary of Homeland Security, this body was created after the September 11, 2001 attacks regarding the interior security of the United States from foreign threats. The Ambassador to the United Nations, so the Attorney General is Pak Su-min. The Secretary of Homeland Security is Pak Jun-young. This Ambassador to the United Nations is Ju Chun-sok. Again, very high profile position because it's the only global international organization that's supposed to deal with international diplomatic issues. The administrator for the Agency for International Development, USAID, right, that we talked about, that funded the American University in Bulgaria, where I was at, is Pang Shiho. The White House Chief of Staff, that's the top administrative assistant to the U.S. president. So it might be the second most powerful person in the U.S. government is the White House Chief of Staff, right? Because this person oversees access to the president. The President of the United States is the final decision maker in domestic and foreign policy, and this person is overseeing the organization of the White House, basically. The functioning of the White House as the pinnacle of the executive branch of this vast executive branch of the United States government that really ballooned beginning in the 1930s and then during the Cold War. And then the National Security Advisor, that position was created as part of the National Security Act of 1947. That is Hwang Tae-yong. And so the National Security Advisor, is Im Jae-yoon. National Security Advisor Im Jae-yoon. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top military official, David Miley, is Hwang Dae-yong. So these, of course, we don't have enough people in the class. There's also a director of national intelligence. That's Averill Haines, is referenced in Dr. Corey Shockey's editorial, Averill Haines, but we don't have enough students to have the Director of National Intelligence there. But you can see these are the regular attendees of the National Security Council, right? Well, they're more than that. These people also attend, but these are the top officials in the U.S. National Security Council. So bureaucracies prepare by planning scenarios. Like, what if this happens, what do we do? What if this happens, what do we do? What if this happens, what do we do? What if A happens, we do this. If B happens, we do this. If C happens, we do. What do we do? And what do we use in terms of our capabilities and resources to respond? Because we have these capabilities and resources. We know how big our Defense Department is. We know our military bases. We know how many guns, bullets, ships. We know where they are. We know how many we have. We know where they are. We know what we have. What do we do if the Russians use nuclear weapons in Ukraine? What do we do? Let's plan, because if it happens tomorrow, next week, next month, the US president is going to say, well, what do we do? And we have to say, okay, Mr. President, we have these three options. Be prepared. So please, Mr. President, choose from these three options. But you have to have the options ready to go, which means you have to think ahead of time, long ahead of time. Because the US president has to respond and respond now. So let's plan. So this is in, here's, again, I always pay attention to the BBC monitoring service regarding the Ukrainian and Russian and Moldovan and other media that they translate in English. And so here's an article that came out. I'm gonna make sure you can see this. So, no, not that. Clicked on the wrong thing, sorry. We go here and we click on this. This was in the US. This is from Evropejska Pravda, which is a website and is monitored by the BBC in London, translated into English and put on the on my access on my database that I get in the library to read what's going on here. So Ukraine website views the possibility of Russian nuclear strikes. You know, Russia is having military difficulties. It's losing territory. It's being driven out by Ukrainian soldiers armed for the most part with, well, I guess for the most part, yeah, with American and Western military material, American military advice, American military intelligence, the American CIA and other military intelligence organizations are providing intelligence service reports to the Ukrainian military. I'm sure, you know, since 2014, the US military has been training Ukrainian officers. I'm sure of it. I'm sure that the American military played important roles in identifying very promising, skillful Ukrainian officers that should be promoted because they've done it before. I mean, I've seen them do that during the Cold War and elsewhere. So, and it's working. The Ukrainians, of course, are motivated, unlike the Afghanistan government that the Americans had in power. The Ukrainians are nationalists and they're really motivated to fight. We know they're willing to fight because they're willing to kill and die. And they have been killing and dying by the thousands since February. So they're motivated and the Americans are helping them and they're beginning to push back and retake lots of territory. We're getting all these reports about the Russians panicking, just abandoning their weapons, running away, and the Ukrainians becoming even more furious as they find these evidence of war crimes and mass graves. And Putin is responding by calling up Russian forces, mobilizing 300,000 Russians to go to war. The Russian military, like the US military until this point, have been a largely volunteer organization. Now Russians being forced to go join the army to fight in Ukraine. This crisis is escalating. And there's a concern that Putin, particularly if he's in danger of being overthrown because of incompetence, because of unhappiness in the military, because of Russia's humiliatingly bad performance so far, in the extended war fighting that's continuing now for 7 months, and it will go on for God knows how much longer, and the economic sanctions being put on Russia by the United States and the European Union. The European Union just put on the 8th round of sanctions on Russia. That Russia government might become desperate and may use nuclear weapons in some way. And the aim is to try to convince, particularly the United States, to stop providing weapons and training and intelligence and help to the Ukrainians, to make the Ukrainians agree at least to a ceasefire, to make the Ukrainians stop trying to retake the territory that they've lost to the Russians so far, with the Russians believing that they could not do this. The Ukrainians could not do this without American aid. So the Americans are extending this war that has killed tens of thousands of Russian soldiers as well as Ukrainians. So I emphasize that, we're talking thousands of Russian boys, young men, as well as officers being killed. And from the perspective of a Russian nationalist, because the Americans are using the Ukrainians to do this. So continues to be lots of speculation about maybe the Russians might use nuclear weapons as bargaining leverage against the Americans. And so here's a Ukrainian website translated in English. I'm not going to go through it all. It's long, right? It's translated in English about this speculation about how Russia might use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. And so, I'll post it on the website in case you're interested to reading it yourself. But there's 3 scenarios highlighted in this European Pravda, Evropskaya Pravda Ukrainian website. The first one is the use of Russian nuclear weapons in retaliation. So how would the U.S. respond? Okay, how would the U.S. respond if Russia uses nuclear weapons? Let's say if Russia uses nuclear weapons, of course, Russia is unlikely to use a nuclear weapon to make Kiev disappear, to destroy the city of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. That would probably lead to World War III, because if only because there are thousands and thousands of French people, Americans, others living in Kiev, including diplomatic personnel. There are embassies in Kiev. So if Russia used nuclear weapons against Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, the government of Ukraine, it would kill lots of non-Ukrainians, and that would probably lead to a nuclear response. That the Americans would have to use violent force against the Russians if they dropped a nuclear weapon on Kiev to try to erase the Ukrainian government. So what's more likely? We talked about this before. Maybe Russia detonates a nuclear bomb over the Black Sea, over the North Pole, somehow to indicate that it's moving towards using nuclear weapons on the battlefield. And the one proposal was that Russia might use nuclear weapons against Snake Island. That Russia would use nuclear weapons at first, for the first time. According to the strategy, the first strike is demonstrative. Its essence is to target a relatively deserted area, like the Black Sea, blow it up over the ocean, the Black Sea Ocean, or so on. It may have no political objectives, but it will show Russia's readiness to use nuclear weapons. The authors of the strategy believe that after the first strike, the adversary will have to agree to capitulation. In other words, the Americans will stop the war. They'll stop, even if Ukrainians don't want to stop, the Americans will stop giving them weapons. And if this is not the case, the second strike will be launched on an area which is not densely populated, where there is a cluster of troops or infrastructure or other facilities which is symbolic to the victim. So maybe they drop a bomb, the Americans don't stop giving weapons to the Ukrainians, and then the Russians drop a bomb somewhere in Ukraine that destroys a military Ukrainian base, that has these weapons that the Americans gave to them, right? It is only after this that Russia will deliver strikes on actual targets. Of course, there is no guarantee that Russia will stick to the script, just like there is no guarantee that a nuclear war will break out eventually. However, opting for this very strategy is quite likely, this website says. This is from just a few days ago. Therefore, one can hear increasingly frequently from Kremlin propagandists in Russia ideas about a strike on Snake Island, the first stage. Oh, by the way, I think, did we do the attendance? No, we didn't. Okay, let's do the attendance. So your smart attendance number is 748. So let me, okay, I forgot to do this, so don't want to forget. All right, 748. Let me put that in the Zoom. So we go to, okay, got that done. So back to the exercise. So share screen, back to this. So therefore, one can hear increasingly frequently from Kremlin propagandists in Russia ideas about a strike on Snake Island. That's the first stage. So what is the Snake Island? So here is Snake Island. And I think you can see that. Let me make sure that you can see that. So there it is. It's just a big rock with a military base on it. And here you can see Snake Island. This is part of Crimea. This is the province of Odessa. So Odessa is a city. You don't really see it here, but this is all part of Ukraine here. So this is Snake Island. And there's a military base there. Right now, there's some number of Russian, Ukrainian troops there. How many? I don't really know. It's not big. Does it say how many Ukrainians are there? The Russians took it at the beginning of the February war, and then the Ukrainians took it back. So what does it say here about how many Ukrainian soldiers there? If there are Ukrainian soldiers there, there's just a handful. So what does it say? Well, it says 30 people live there. Maybe the Ukrainians don't want to say. So there's about 30 people that live on this rock in 2012. There you can see it. That's Snake Island. So as a demonstrative strike, maybe the Russians would drop, the Russians took it and then the Ukrainians took it back. So the Ukrainians have this. And supposedly in controlling this big rock is necessary for access to the port of Odessa, a Black Sea port that Ukraine needs to export its grain and exports its food exports, its wheat, its sunflowers. It's so important for the world food supply that you need to control this island if you want to have access to the Odessa port of the city of Odessa on the Black Sea that is still under control by the Ukrainians, although the Russians have been dropping missiles on it and killed a number of people there. So in this demonstrative strike, Russia would drop an atomic bomb on this island and kill some, number of people. But, like I said, it's just a big rock. So as Russia becomes more desperate, as this war becomes increasingly more and more a political disaster, catastrophe, as well as a military catastrophe, but a political disaster for Putin that even might threaten his life if he fails in keeping the territory that Russia invaded and has killed tens of thousands of people since this war escalated in February. That this is where there's speculation where Russia might demonstrate its will to use nuclear weapons by dropping an atomic bomb, the first time dropped in anger since World War II here. So, US bureaucracy, prepare options for Joe Biden in case this happens. So, divide up into, so remember who you are on the US National Security Strategy, National Security Council. And the first group that we're going to divide into three groups. The first group, explain to us why retaliating with a nuclear strike on a Russian facility of some sort would be the appropriate strategy. Play devil's advocate. Argue why the US should use a nuclear bomb in response somehow, somewhere, if Russians use a nuclear bomb on Snake Island. If the Russians blow up a nuclear bomb on Snake Island, that the Americans must blow up a nuclear bomb somewhere, somehow. Explain how, where. The second group, explain how the option rather should be, if Russia blows up a nuclear bomb on Snake Island, that the US should respond only using conventional weapons. The Americans should respond, but they should do so with non-nuclear weapons. And the third group that we're going to divide into, explain how the best response, again, we want to hear strong arguments, right? You're advocating, the third one is non-military methods such as diplomatic or economic isolation or military aid to Russia's adversaries without US intervention. That should be the appropriate response. So you're assigned these positions. You might not believe them, but I want to hear you make an argument how your assigned group, your assigned option is the best option. You might not believe that, but please try to explain how it could be the best option. So what we need to do now is divide up into three groups. So in the breakout room, so we have divide up into three groups, assign automatically, and there you go, okay? So we have group 1, group 2, and room 1, room 2, and room 3. So I'm going to open your rooms. Please join these rooms. Room 1, come up with an argument for option 1 and explain it a little bit, like, okay, if the US is going to use nuclear weapons, where should it use it? Do the best you can. Room 2, focus on option 2, and room 3, focus on option 3. So let me open the rooms. So please join the rooms. Join the rooms. Okay, room 1, there you see it. Come up with an argument for why the US should respond in some way with nuclear bomb if Russia uses a nuclear bomb on Snake Island. And, you know, do the best you can. I know you don't have a lot of time, but come up with an argument, and ideally even a suggestion of where the US should drop that bomb. Should it target something that doesn't kill any Russians? Should it kill Russians? Should they blow up a ship? What should the Americans do with their nuclear bomb if they're going to use nuclear bombs in response to Russia blowing up a nuclear bomb on Snake Island?
Not like
Yeah.
nuclear,
Yeah, I think it's
just conventional weapons, I think.
So room two, you're going to come up with an argument how the US should respond only with conventional weapons. How? Okay, please explain. So room three, you are going to come up with an argument why the US should not respond with deadly force, nuclear conventional, but only with more economic sanctions and military aid to Russia's adversaries if Russia were to detonate a nuclear bomb on Snake Island.
Nuclear bomb.
We have to attack Snake Island.
Yes. Isn't
But-
am I
But
wrong?
I thought that the Snake Island is belong to Ukraine. So
Oh,
I understood that he's
That's
saying that
correct.
if Russia attacks this
Okay, so what are you guys considering? Blandine? Room one. Blondine, you're muted. Everybody's muted. So okay. So what is your group thinking that right now? I'm trying. I can't. I'm challenged as well in terms of coming up with a scenario. Where would the U.S. detonate a nuclear bomb in response? If Russia dropped a nuclear bomb on Snake Island and killed the 50 or so people, let's say, living there, how would the Americans respond with a nuclear bomb? Where would they do that?
I guess that we agree on logging a bomb on the center of Russian communication. I think that was the point in our group.
So on Russian territory, blowing up a nuclear bomb, sending a nuclear weapon to explode over Russia?
Yes, I guess.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah, of course, it could escalate. I mean, you know, Russians could think you send one weapon, you send one nuclear bomb, you tell the Russians it's coming, you launch one missile, only one missile, you send the missile, I don't know, from the United States and only one missile, and you send it into somewhere in Siberia and you blow up a Russian communications facility in the middle of Siberia. You kill some handful of Russians, but that's it.
But that's fair.
You think you can get away with that without the Russians responding?
Yes, but they large a bomb on Snake Island, so it will be just fair.
Oh, I mean, I don't have a wrong answer. Okay. So as you think through the scenario, you think the Russians will go, okay, well, we're not going to blow something else up. Well, they'll stop. You think the Russians won't escalate?
No, I don't know. That's a big danger. Yes, I agree. But I guess if we have to answer, there is no more. There is no better place than Siberia. There is nothing around.
Okay.
If
Let
I
me go to the
had
other group.
choice, I won't answer.
Let me talk to the other group. Okay.
Yes.
I don't have an answer. I mean, I don't know myself. I haven't thought through this. I mean, so let me go to the second group, see what they have to. Okay.
Good morning, sir.
Okay, Junior, are you ready to
Yeah.
speak? Do you have something prepared?
Yeah. Basically, the thing is, U.S. military. The thing is, U.S. Military should has to take that option that attack to Russia by conventional methods, because basically I think it's the most proper and appropriate option for them, because if US shoot a missile, especially like nuclear, then to Russia, and it could be, it could be a World War III, and if if US should miss nuclear weapons to Russia, then Russia and China, like, because they are allies, so that's why they might be they should counterattack to Russia by nuclear weapons. So, and it could be a serious problem. So that's why we need to block this situation. And last, if US doesn't act anything, then US couldn't prove and show their role and influence all over the world. So that's why, so it means also all of our allies of US could be disappointed about US, like the behavior of US. So that's why I think the conventional weapons is the most appropriate action and option for them.
Okay, as I have to go to room 3 now before we start, so everybody come out of the room, but please tell us think about what you suggest that the US would destroy or attack with conventional weapons. What specifically? Russian ship, a military ship, naval ship, a Russian naval base, what specifically? So I'll let you think about that. Okay, so room 3. So what do you have some ideas ready to go in terms of what kind of economic and military sanctions would be put on Russia as a consequence if it uses nuclear weapons on Snake Island? Milo?
What kind of economic?
Yeah, what do you want? What would you propose doing?
I don't know. Maybe to cut off. Oh, sorry. To cut off the energy of. I don't know what.
Well, think about it, because now we have 7 minutes left in class, so we have to leave all the rooms. Okay, so Blondine or for room 1, well, let's flip a coin. Let's see who's going to speak first. So heads, it's room 1. And it's, sorry, I want to, and it is tails. So heads, it's room 2. And damn it. Heads, it's room 2. And it's heads, so room 2. So if the Russians blow up a nuclear bomb on Snake Island, what conventional weapons response should the Americans have? So I think we had Junyoung Park. So could you tell us what you would attack with conventional weapons, Junyoung Park, for room 2?
Could you repeat again?
What would you do? What would you do? Tell us what you would do with with conventional weapons.
I think like if just US should like conventional weapons, then it could be boat or like ship or whatever. It could be many plans. Like
So
not just direct, just in it could they can shoot not only just a direct one but also like indirect one as well. So that's why it could be many options.
So what do you suggest? Did they attack a Russian military naval ship or a Russian military base?
No, not base, just like an indirect one, like never.
What do you mean indirect? I mean, you're going to use conventional weapons. How would you use the conventional weapons? What would you blow up with conventional weapons? What would you attack?
Not based on the military one.
So civilians? You mean like blow up that bridge? Like it was blown up. Somebody blew up that bridge between Crimea and the Russian mainland that Vladimir Putin built after he annexed Crimea. That Kerch Bridge, that was the pride of Putin. You think that might be an option, that basically the Americans could blow that up? And, you know, maybe nobody would be on it, but they would finish the job. They would blow that up. Well, that's one of many options, but we need to go to the other because we only have 3 minutes left in class. So heads, it's room 1. and it's tail. No, it's tail. So room 3, sorry. So that's Milo. Milo, what kind of economic and military sanctions should be placed on Russia if they use nuclear weapons on Snake Island?
I think we have to cut off the supply of oil and energy resources. We need to work with the oil production countries to cut off delivery
Of everything. Just isolate
yes.
Russia completely. Yeah, I don't
Yes.
know what I mean. That means no planes, no airline flights. Like Russia would become like North Korea in the world economy. It will be that isolated.
It's
Okay,
difficult.
maybe. I mean, I don't know if the Chinese would actually agree to implement that. I mean, I don't know if the Chinese. I mean, the Chinese. That's a critical question. Would the Chinese respond, support those sanctions? Because they would have to support those sanctions for that to work, right?
Okay. Yes.
So would China agree? I mean, they agreed on North Korea, although not really. They sort of like helped North Korea a little bit, but they might agree on a U.S. Security Council. They might agree, at least officially, to put sanctions on Russia. So something like North Korea. Okay.
Okay.
Since we only have 2 minutes left. Okay, group 1. I asked Blandine. Vladimir spoke first. So Blandine or Vladimir, who wants to speak for the nuclear option?
Okay, our idea was to just drop a nuclear bomb on a communication base like in Siberia. I don't know, but perhaps if Russia still maintains position in the war, perhaps we could use nuclear weapons in like a military area, or I don't know.
A big one or a small one?
A small one.
Of course, if you're a Cold Warrior in the United States, you say, this is what the Russians want. They think that we're sissies, that we don't have the will and determination like Russia has. So we have to use nuclear weapons to show them that we will not let them blackmail us into doing what they want to do in terms of partitioning a neighboring country in Ukraine. No, we have to respond with nuclear weapons. We have to show them we have the will and determination to respond to their aggression. So this, of course, is so let me, since we only have a minute left, I set up a vote on Cyber Campus. So we go to vote and go add, and we go for week 7, and we go make it. Let's make it anonymous here. So 22, 10, 10, and so we go option 1, nuclear weapons. Room 2, group 2, room 2, we make it 12 o'clock. All right. Conventional weapons response. Three is economic and military isolation. Isolation response. Okay, so here we go. All right, so vote. It's anonymous. Oh shit. No, let me edit this, make this anonymous. Okay, so now it's anonymous. So what do you select option 1? It's anonymous, so you can be honest. You select option 1, nuclear weapons response to Russia's use of nuclear weapons on Snake Island. 2, a conventional weapons response, blow something up that belongs to Russia. Or 3, just economic and military sanctions increase. So please vote. It's anonymous. No, but only one person wants to use nuclear weapons. Okay, well. All right. Well, I guess that's where we have to stop. Okay. So we'll think about this through the rest of the semester. Okay. So that's it for today. Any questions? If not, bye.
Bye. Bye.